Well, hello there. If you remember, a while back I made a video analyzing why Sly 4 was a commercial failure and why as a result of that we'll never see Sly 5. Something I still very much stand by, and every single day that Sly 5 doesn't happen further proves my point. Some people are still holding out for Sly 5, but then again some people still think vaccines are evil, so some people just can't be helped. Did I just equate hardcore Sly fans to anti-vaxxers? Yes, because I'm an asshole. And for the record, I don't care how many quote-unquote leaks there are, because we've had dozens of fake Sly 5 leaks ever since Thieves In Time came out, the first of which was only a few months after. So at this point, I think everybody should be taking every single quote-unquote leak with mountainous piles of salt. But while we took a look at the reasons why Sly 5 will 99.99% never happen, nobody's ever stopped and really taken a look at why Sly 5 probably should happen? Taken a look at why Sly 5 probably should never happen. I submit this for your consideration. Thieves in Time was such a creative dead end that I don't think you could make a decent 5th Sly Cooper game, at least not without making heavy sacrifices that would take away what makes Sly Cooper what it is. I'm not saying it couldn't be done. I do, however, think there's so much working against a hypothetical Sly 5 both internally and externally that any writer or a game designer worth their salt would ask the exact same question if they were handed this project. Why are we doing this? Hear me out. So I'm sure everybody watching knows the secret ending to Thieves in Time. Sly's trapped in ancient Egypt. If you didn't, you do now. So because of how Thieves in Time ends, you're essentially given two options on where to take the plot for a hypothetical 5th game. You either have Sly being rescued being the plot, or you have him being rescued as an aside and the rest of the game be based around something else. That's it. Those are the only two options you have. Why is this a problem? Because neither of these can work as a game. What is the essence of what makes a Sly Cooper game what it is, from a gameplay standpoint at least? Well, there are a few major things. First of all, open world hub-based gameplay. That's not an issue, you can put an open world hub-based mission structure into plenty of stories, but what else do you have? Well, heists for a start. Each chapter from Band of Thieves onward consisted of a multi-layer, elaborate heist set up over multiple missions. Then you have the group dynamic, Sly, Murray, Bentley, and occasionally other characters who fill other roles. The fact is, the group dynamic and heist-centric mission structure is so deeply entrenched in the series' identity at this point that you can't remove it. It would be like eliminating the sandbox in GTA. This is where we run into the first problem. Sly Cooper's gameplay is inherently rigidly designed, because the heist-centric gameplay and group dynamic makes the identity of Sly Cooper something that's so specific that you can't really change anything about it without removing what gives it its identity. Something like Mario-style 3D platforming is so versatile in its design that there are dozens of different ways you can present the gameplay in a fresh style. Even something like Ratchet & Clank shooting gameplay is versatile enough that you can get away with having a few differing spin-offs here and there. Sly is not versatile because it's very specialized, if you see what I mean. Why am I bringing this up? Well, it's because the first problem we run into with a hypothetical Sly 5 is the fact that the group starts out separated. Sly is in ancient Egypt while the rest of the gang is in the modern day having no idea where he is. And hell, if you didn't get the Platinum Trophy, you wouldn't even know Sly is in Egypt. So screw the portion of the already small player base for Thieves in Time that didn't get the Platinum Trophy and as a result, didn't know the secret ending. Regardless, from a storytelling point of view, you're kinda stuck between a rock and a hard place, because on one hand, if you use Sly being separated from the group for the entire game to try and create a compelling plot about trying to find him, you'd be keeping the characters away from each other, thereby sacrificing the group dynamic the gameplay and story is built upon. Because it's been so many years since Thieves in Time, Sly 5 would by definition be a comeback game, and the last thing you want in a comeback game is to make something completely opposed to what the audience wants or expects. To pick a completely random example, Devil May Cry 5 was a comeback game for a series that had been dormant for several years. That game was traditional Devil May Cry gameplay through and through, and people loved it. But what if they took away the swords and only gave you ranged combat? That would suck, but taking away the group dynamic in Sly is like taking away the hack and slash aspects of Devil May Cry. They are inseparable elements from the franchise, and taking them away would only be made worse by the gap between releases. Even if you could earn the audience's trust enough to make a change like that, the series has been out of our collective consciousness for so long that you'd first need to re-establish what the series is before you subvert that. God of War had 6 very similar games before it earned the right to change the gameplay style. But because of Thieves in Time ending with the group being separated through time and space, to make a compelling rescue plot, it would be a game that fundamentally and radically alters the gameplay in a very unwanted way. You would essentially be making the series something so far removed from what people want out of Sly that you might as well subtitle the game Lost the Plot. Even further, if you do have the entire plot be based around rescuing Sly, that also alters the story in a very unwanted way by eliminating the character dynamic that made for such appealing dialogue in previous games. Are you just going to have Murray and Bentley and maybe Carmelita as the central characters? What's Sly doing during all this? Is he just chilling, or does he have something going on his end? Are you just going to alternate between chapters in the past and chapters in the present? If so, what's Sly's story? Is it just pointless filler while Murray and Bentley work out the important details? Are they really dumb enough to make chapters without Sly and some without Bentley and Murray and whoever else? Would there be anyone who would actually want a game where at least a significant chunk doesn't include Sly? Are they aware that having the entire plot be based around rescuing Sly makes the entire game completely one note and static, unlike the multi-layered and ever-evolving stories of the previous games? That would be boring as hell. You see what I mean? Both from a storytelling and gameplay perspective, this entire setup would be a completely disjointed mess, especially from the perspective of a lapsed fan who might pick the game up out of curiosity. On the other hand, you might say, well, why don't they just find Sly in the prologue and then have the plot be based around something completely unrelated? Well, that would certainly give you a chance to get things back to zero, but it would be no less reductive to the game had it been made. This point's a little bit harder to articulate, so if I meander a little bit, forgive me. If they were to solve the Sly missing in Egypt thing right at the beginning of the game, it would come across as a laughably insincere and contrived way to bring the series back to a point in which they could get things back to normal. I imagine it would go something like this.
I won't bore you with the details of our miraculous escape, but we desperately need a—
Destroy the time machine. It also starts the story off by being a completely unfocused mess before we're even in the door. The phrase, have the game be about something completely unrelated, is a massive red flag for a game that's supposed to be a direct continuation of another. Thieves in Time was the first game in the series to have a cliffhanger ending. Please note there's a big difference between a sequel hook and a cliffhanger, and by starting up a game by tying up a story that was by definition unfinished, it's a tacit admission that they have no idea what they're doing, where the series is going, and are basically trying to sweep it under the rug and pretend that it never happened, retroactively putting a spotlight on just how pointless Thieves in Time was and how thoroughly written into a corner they were, which would furthermore be a tacit admission that the ending and by extension the entirety of Thieves in Time was a horrible idea to begin with, which is a great way to run your series, don't you know? He said sarcastically. Worse yet, you're front-loading an entire game's worth of plot and exposition into like the first 20 minutes. You need to establish what's happened, who these characters are, what's going on, how Sly ended up in Egypt, how they found Sly in the meantime, how they're rescuing him, they need to show the rescue, and then from there you need to establish the plot the rest of the game is going to base itself around, whether that be about time travel or not. And if it's not, establish why you're getting rid of it, and that would be weird to start a game with time travel and then just immediately get rid of it. Either way, just look at how much story-based baggage you have to get through before you can even think about doing your own thing, and I'm probably forgetting about some steps they have to go through. And all of this just because they pointlessly wrote themselves into a corner. The way I'm describing this hypothetically honestly reminds me of the intro to Rise of Skywalker. You know, the movie where they front-load about 2 movies worth of exposition into the title crawl alone. And speaking as someone who liked The Last Jedi despite its issues, any comparisons to Rise of Skywalker is a bad thing. All of this would be too much too quick, thereby starting the game off at the point of already being a fractal bloated mess. This is all made worse when you consider the purpose of the prologue. A prologue is supposed to be about introducing the story, and in Sly, it's usually used to great effect in order to draw players in with the intrigue before telling you what's going on. Even Thieves in Time, despite my issues with that game, had a pretty good prologue, except for the part where they torpedo the relationship storyline out of nowhere. But if you use that entire part of the game in order to front-load a resolution just so you can get things back on some level of track, you're starting the game off as a disjointed mess that will forcefully, awkwardly pivot into some other plot with all the ceremony of a wet fart. Could it hypothetically recover from that? I don't think so. If your starting point is this, with no real direction to go afterward, I think it can only get worse. And even if it does get better, you still have a bloated corpse for the first third of the game. I think this clip sums it up nicely.
It's not without positive qualities, but by that point it's not enough to glue the deal back together. It pranced into the room, tripped on the cat and smashed the aquarium with its head. It's not going to mend the evening by shakily getting up and showing us its collection of football stickers.
And that problem is only made worse by the fact that we're still shackled to the same Sly, Murray, Bentley, and Carmelita from Thieves in Time. The 4 of which were ruined beyond all recognition in Thieves in Time with the exception of maybe Bentley. Once again, do they proceed whole hog with the completely unlikable main characters, or do they pretend that Thieves in Time never happened? Or would your average screenwriter even know what was wrong with them in Thieves in Time? The point I'm getting at here is that Sly 4 took time before it got to the point of irreparably damaging the series, but Sly 5 starts from that point. It would be starting with having an unsalvageable and laughably contrived story, basically meaning that you're sending the game out to die. The game might be fine on the gameplay front, but as has been established by Thieves in Time, passable gameplay can't save a Sly Cooper game, because Sly Cooper has always been an above-average stealth action series elevated by its story. So if you want to try and tell me that story doesn't matter in Sly Cooper, you're objectively wrong. Without story, Sly Cooper wouldn't be 1/10 as memorable. So between these two options, they either need to sacrifice gameplay at the altar of the story but will still end up with a messy story, or sacrifice the story at the altar of gameplay with no guarantee of good gameplay. If you don't understand why these are issues from a storytelling point of view, let's take the example of something like, say, Endgame. That's a story that was a payoff of a years-long saga where the previous entry ended on a cliffhanger. So if they just get Sly out of Egypt and then have the plot revolve around something else after the fact, then what you end up with is a situation where, like, if Endgame had the first third of the movie happen as it did, where they find and kill Thanos, only in this case he still has the Infinity Stones and they reverse the dusting of half the universe, and then the rest of the movie awkwardly pivots to being about something completely unrelated. Does that not sound stupid and disjointed? Resolving the major plot from the previous film casually and just doing something unrelated? But if the entire game were to revolve around Sly and Egypt trying to get back to the present, that would be like if the first 2/3 of Endgame was just Tony Stark in space drifting along before he's rescued by Captain Marvel, and then the movie ends with the scene I just described where they find Thanos, he still has the Infinity Stone, they kill him, reverse the dusting, and pie and ice cream for everyone. Once again, we run into the issue where the plot would be resolved, but most of the run-up to the plot being resolved would be completely inconsequential and boring. You would also be sacrificing one of the key driving factors of the series, which, you know, in that case is the Avengers, how they interact with each other, their group dynamic, etc, 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 because most of the movie would still have the Avengers separated and Tony Stark would still be drifting through space, which in this case is the most accurate parallel to Sly in Egypt. This is the problem with being shackled to a cliffhanger. You're obligated to pay it off. It's not something you can just ignore. Now, of course, this isn't a perfect comparison because I'm comparing a masterpiece to, well, Thieves in Time, but the point still stands. I maintain that I don't think anybody on the writing staff thought this cliffhanger through. They just threw it in there for whatever reason. It's a cliffhanger for the sake of having one, and we take it for granted, but it's one of those things where if you give it any level of critical thought, it really is something that was haphazardly included and makes a continuation nearly impossible. If they just didn't include the cliffhanger, this whole thing would be so much easier, but because we're shackled to the cliffhanger, we're obliged to pay it off. On balance, the option where they just throw away the cliffhanger and rescue Sly right off the bat would probably be the better option, but once you do that, what then? What plot threads remain that could create a compelling story? There's really nowhere to go, and more to the point, no story relevant to Sly's characterization I can think of that hasn't already been told. The only remaining plot thread is Penelope, who, as we know, escaped prison in the epilogue of Thieves in Time. And I'm sorry, but a game with Penelope as a main, or God forbid, the main villain, is destined for failure. And why is that? Because not a single thing about Penelope as a villain works in any way. Her motivation makes no sense. Her shift in personality just feels so jarringly wrong because it's so unlike who she was portrayed as in Honor Among Thieves. And then there's the matter of the voice acting, which is incredibly forced because being sinister is obviously something that does not come naturally to the voice actress who played her. It's not something you can just retcon, like you can't establish she was under mind control or something. Why? Because there was that entire section of Thieves in Time where she was monologuing to nobody in particular about how evil she was. If you're evil while nobody is watching, or when you think nobody's watching, then you're just evil. So because she's evil and still at large, she has to be a major factor in this series going forward. That cat's out of the bag, you can't just put it back in, which would technically make Penelope the most prominent side character in the entire series, and considering that 2/3 of her portrayals would be absolutely abysmal, that's a hilarious shame. You could make her good again via retcon, but once again, that's a rock and a hard place situation. You either egregiously contrive her back to the side of good and just ignore all the BS that contradicts a sudden face turn from Thieves in Time, or you just go with her being a horrible main villain. Either way, your options are bleak. Once again though, would Penelope somehow be tied to Sly being lost in Egypt, or would her machinations be the plot that they awkwardly pivot to? The only possible connection I can think of would be if Penelope sends Murray and Bentley back in time to where Sly is to try and get rid of them. That connects the two conflicts without resolving anything and reunites the gang, but this has its own set of issues. One, it's a horribly unforgivable contrivance that Penelope would send them back to exactly where Sly would be, but then you also run into the same issue I brought up earlier where most of the game would be completely inconsequential. Once they're back in time, Then what? What's the overarching goal? Is the entire game about getting back to the present to take out Penelope? That's A, lame as hell, and B, about as one note as it gets. You're limited to stories that can take place within a series of environments and be based around some sort of multi-layer heist or equivalent. So once again, unless you want to change the gameplay in a very unwanted way, what kind of story can you tell with Penelope as the main villain and or the entire gang being sent back in time that includes these multi-layer heists and open worlds? And then there's also one more giant elephant in the room that makes things difficult. Now that they've introduced time travel as a plot point, where can you go from that? Because once you've introduced power scaling on the level of time travel, you've kind of reached a point of no return. You can't really go back to smaller scale stories as far as an ongoing plot is concerned, not without it coming across as inherently inconsequential. An ongoing story requires higher stakes, so as an escalation of stakes from Thieves in Time, where do you go once Sly is out of Egypt? Do you continue with time travel? Do you do space travel, interdimensional travel? And once we've reached that point, does anybody not think that we've strayed a little bit too far from the original essence of what made Sly Cooper what it was to begin with? How did this become this? Honestly, I think including time travel to begin with was the series completely losing its way. But as an aside, time travel is not something that ruins a series on its own, but if they did make a sequel that was centered around time travel or something grander, that would mean that the franchise would have just as many games based around ridiculous sci-fi elements as it would have based around heists. At that point, what even is Sly? I'm not saying that Sly 5 couldn't be done, I'm just saying that it probably shouldn't. And I've seen a bunch of Sly 5 pitches from various fans over the years, some being relatively safe and some being absolutely bonkersburg. I think my favorite WTF one was the one that I saw that included, among other things, bringing back Dr. M as a cyborg. I can't even put into words how absurdly stupid that is, and I would love to play that game for the sheer hilarity. Either way, every possibility I've seen runs into the same issues to varying degrees. The issue of practicality, the issue of picking up where Sly 4 left off, being left in such a creative dead end that you really can't do it without massive gaping compromises. The series needs to unfuck itself before it can move on, and I don't think that's possible. I almost kind of want to visit the universe where Sly 5 did get made because I have a morbid curiosity to see how bad it could have gotten. You know, I've been on the writing staff for a few short films, but I'm by no means a professional screenwriter. However, if I was a professional screenwriter, this is the type of project that I would be absolutely mortified to work on. Following up on a previous game's plot, avoiding all these issues, and still, once you're done with all of that, making a compelling, well-written story that has something worth doing. A story that has something to say, and then once all that's done, I would be asking myself, where are we going with this? Sly's 1 to 3 had a point, a direction, something they wanted to say, and they fulfilled everything that they wanted to do by the time the third game rolled around. Did anybody ever consider where they wanted to take the story once they revived the franchise with Thieves in Time? I don't think they thought that far ahead, otherwise they wouldn't have written themselves into a corner. Did Thieves in Time ever even need to be made? Probably not. But Sly 5 sure as hell shouldn't be made. Not that it was ever going to happen anyway. You know, I think that we as a gaming collective are so accustomed to endless sequels that when something does end naturally, we have a visceral rejection of the idea. It's like, you know, The Legend of Zelda has been going on for God knows how many years, why can't my favorite franchises keep going? Well, because not all franchises are created equally. Sometimes things don't have the same versatility and endless sequel ability. Sometimes things just end when they're supposed to end, and that's okay. Sly Cooper, by its very essence, was epic, and that's a bit of a double-edged sword because it means that every game is significant, but it means that you can only go on for so long before you've done everything that you can do with these set of characters, and before these characters reach their logical conclusion, and the gameplay isn't so versatile that it can carry the franchise on its own. Whether intentional or not, each game in the trilogy was epic, and part of an ongoing story that all played off each other with such a tightly established canon that there's almost no room for anything other than the established events. Every character comes out of each game fundamentally changed, and each story matters in its own way. There has never been an inconsequential Sly Cooper game, and quite frankly, there aren't enough games in the series where they can get away with having an inconsequential story. Especially considering that it's a series of only 4 games that have spanned, 11 years? The fact is, 3 games was perfect for Sly, and it ended on a perfect note. As a matter of fact, I feel like continuing after Sly 3 was kind of a betrayal of the theming that Sly 3 was going for. because the entirety of Honor Among Thieves is about progress triumphing over tradition, and by the end of the game, Sly, in his dying moments, realizes how much of a burden the Cooper legacy has been on him, his friends, and even his enemies. Through that, he realizes how much better his life could be if he gave it all up. It was a perfect ending that felt like a true payoff to everything in the trilogy, and by the end of Honor Among Thieves, you pretty much tied up everybody's character arc thoroughly. While I liked the idea of having more Sly in 2013, in hindsight, Thieves in Time comes across as, at best, the video game equivalent of sucking on a popsicle stick after the popsicle is already gone. And now the series has been dead since 2013, so beyond the hardcore fan base, most of the gaming landscape has moved on. If the series has any hope to come back, they would need to establish what the series even is again to a wider audience. And as I've said before, we're in a period of peak nostalgia for the series because the people who played these games as kids but moved on will likely be getting to the point of nostalgia for the series and want to re-experience it. So right now, the only way to bring the series back would be to capitalize on nostalgia and make a trilogy remake. I've already discussed the logistics issues that prevent a Thieves in Time sequel from succeeding, such as who is the audience for this game? Pretty much exclusively people who bought Thieves in Time and are still pining for a sequel. Nostalgia's not going to fuel sales for a sequel to a game that most people who played the original trilogy but moved on with the passing of the tides haven't played. You may get a few people buying it out of curiosity, but it's not what the majority of people who played this series growing up want. Would a Crash Bandicoot comeback have been half as successful if it were a sequel to Mind Over Mutant instead of a remake of the games that most people have played? Hell no. So a sequel to Thieves in Time at this point is almost guaranteed to be DOA. So right now, the only way to bring Sly back would be to capitalize on nostalgia and make a trilogy remake. We already have plenty of verifiable market research to suggest that it would be the best direction to take the series as it sits right now. And I think the executives at Sony would be fools not to realize this. I mean, they've seen the sales for Thieves in Time, and I'm sure they know that that's about as good as it's gonna get for Sly 5. But I'm also sure they've seen the sales numbers for the Insane trilogy and the Reignited trilogy and can read the writing on the wall quite clearly. I say trilogy because I think that's probably the best route to go. They could remake Thieves in Time as well, I wouldn't be opposed to it, believe it or not, but there's a logistics issue in that case. This has nothing to do with my personal opinions on the game. Basically, my point is, because the game sold so poorly, it's proof on its own that most people who grew up with Sly haven't played 4 and therefore wouldn't care if it's included or not. But because it's a much different game made on much different hardware, it would probably take several $1 million to remake alongside the trilogy, on top of the millions of dollars it would take to remake the trilogy itself. And how many sales are they really gonna lose by not including Thieves in Time? I'd imagine not many, because Sly fans, myself included, would buy the remake with or without Thieves in Time, and to the people buying it based on nostalgia, Thieves in Time would be at best an afterthought. So logistically speaking, you'd be adding millions of dollars to the project for negligible increases to return of investment. I'm not saying it couldn't happen, I'm just saying they'd probably be better off, both logistically as well as creatively. And if a Sly remake was successful enough to garner a sequel, I personally think they'd be better off pulling a Crash 4 rather than trying to get blood out of this particular stone. Declare Thieves in Time a bizarre what-if story. Not because I hate Thieves in Time, but because I'd rather see the series be in a good creative position and in a state of conclusivity. And if they do decide to take another stab at a 4th game, I'd rather it be something new that doesn't feel redundant like Thieves in Time, and plays into and builds upon the themes of the previous games, rather than contradict them. The stick may be all that remains of this particular popsicle, but maybe there's another popsicle in the box for someone skilled enough to retrieve it. I've completely lost the thread of this metaphor. Still, I may say that a remake is the best way to go right now, but as we know, Sony is notoriously awful at maintaining aging intellectual properties, so who knows if we'll ever see Sly again at this point. That's all up to the fickle whims of fate. If you like this video, feel free to leave a comment telling me what you think, and hit the like button, subscribe button, as well as the notification icon so you never miss out on my various escapades, and if you didn't enjoy it, do it anyway. Maybe then I'll come up with something decent for this bit. I've been the King of Snark Style on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Peace.